Perfect Airbnb rental property. Today, we're going to unpack the who, what, where, when, and whys of short-term rentals here in Australia. We're going to be using the latest industry data and our insider expertise so you can start earning more from your investment. We're here to talk about making money. Property investment is exactly that, an investment. And renting your property on Airbnb can allow you to maximise that rental income. But it's still relatively new. There's over 3 million investment properties in Australia, but less than 50,000 investment properties on Airbnb. So that's only about 1.6% of properties are currently on the short-term rental market. So it's certainly yet to hit the mainstream, and with that, there's an opportunity for you. Today, I'm going to share with you our insights into what elements make up a short-term rental investment worthy property, an overview of the current property market, and what this means to you. We'll also share some tips on where the best gains are to be had. I've grouped today's webinar into two chunks. We've got the property and the market. I'm also going to show you how you can almost without doubt outperform other Airbnb hosts. And I'll give you a hint now, it actually doesn't involve Airbnb, but more about that later. As a bit of background, I'm co-founder of Chill. We're a disruptive property management company that allows investors to earn more from their property investment. We've been providing short-term property management services since 2015 when I listed my first property on Airbnb and realised that within 24 hours, I was making more money renting my place out night by night than I would have on the long-term rental market. So fast forward to today, we've managed over 800 properties around Australia, from Perth to Sydney, Townsville to Hobart, and everywhere in between. Like on any night of the week, we could be hosting up to 2,000 guests in our properties across Australia. So I know firsthand what you need to focus on in order to increase your revenue and manage your costs to make money on Airbnb. Today, I'm live here in our Sydney headquarters. I've already got a bunch of questions from those that have submitted them when RSVPing. Thank you for those. But feel free to jump onto the live chat here on YouTube, and I'll happily take some questions on the fly as well. So Airbnb is growing. For some background, before we delve into what makes for a perfect Airbnb rental, I want to step you through some growth we're seeing on Airbnb across Australia. And I mentioned earlier about the 1.6% of properties actually on the short-term rental market. So what is that? Because there's 250,000 listings on Airbnb and HomeAway, which is similar to Airbnb, right now in Australia. The majority of those are entire homes, which would mean they're the ones that they're not necessarily investment properties. So out of 250,000 listings, 58% are entire homes, but even of that 58%, so what is that, 130,000 listings, not all are investment properties. In fact, you'll find the majority are just individual properties that are being listed on Airbnb for short periods of the year, such as when mum and dad are going traveling for 6 weeks over in Europe or something. So what we're talking about in investment properties on Airbnb is really only probably around 50,000 properties that you're up competing against, which is a good thing because it certainly gives you lots of opportunities. If we jump onto where we're seeing reservations being booked and where we're seeing listings happening, it's a split between all the states, or every state has properties on Airbnb, the majority happening in New South Wales, with almost 40% of listings for entire homes there in New South Wales, Victoria following that, and Queensland, and then it tails off through Western Australia, South Australia, Tas, and look, there's not a whole lot happening in Northern Territory or the ACT. But what's really interesting about this graph, which is on your screen at the moment, is looking at how there's quite a clear correlation between the number of listings in an area and the number of reservations. So it's not that there's a huge bunch of listings being put up in fact, this is a great example, in South Australia, and no one's booking them. Here in South Australia, you can actually see there's, out of the whole proportion of listings across Australia, South Australia has 5% of them. And when it comes to the number of reservations, South Australia has 5% of them. And when it comes to the number of nights booked, South Australia has 5% of them. So there is a correlation there between where there are a lot of listings and where guests are staying. And that's showing that guests are jumping online and seeing what opportunities are available of where they might want to stay and choosing their holidays based on that. It's not just on, oh, I have to go to Sydney or I have to go to Melbourne, so I'm just going to have to book an Airbnb. People are in the tourism space looking at, well, where could I go? And suddenly 5% of listings are in South Australia, so maybe we should go there. If we jump on, just as a bit of background where our experience sits, here at Unchill, our portfolio somewhat mimics the Australian-wide portfolio, where most of our properties are actually in Queensland. So that's sitting at about 37%. So we're skewed towards Queensland, but certainly New South Wales and Victoria are also playing a big part for us. In those smaller states, we're on market really there, if anything, perhaps a little bit overrepresented in Northern Territory, but we see that as a good opportunity where there's less competition. And similar goes for South Australia and Western Australia, where there's less other listings and gives us an opportunity to jump in there. So with that, we understand that as listings in an area grow, reservations grow, number of nights booked grows as well. So across Australia-wide, growth has been huge. There's been exceptional growth in Airbnb entire home listings in Australia. So there's been a 10 times increase in entire homes listings since September 15. So this is in, 4 years, we've seen a 10 times increase in the number of listings. And I mean, that's huge. Here, the one thing that does stand out is the little December peaks, but across all states really, particularly New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria, they're the ones that are really growing at a huge rate. The other smaller states, less so, except Tasmania has been growing a lot as well, and you may have heard a little bit about that in the media. Similarly, at the same time as the number of listings has been growing, the number of bookings has been growing, but at an even faster rate. So in Feb earlier this year, there were 317,000 bookings. And that's a lot of bookings. In fact, in January, there was 420,000, which was a peak that Airbnb's seen in Australia so far. But what's good to see here is that the number of bookings is growing at a faster rate than number of listings. So this is showing an increasing, on the demand side is increasing faster than the supply side, which means prices, as far as your average nightly rate and also when it comes to occupancy, is likely to be increasing as well. And we've certainly seen that in the areas that we operate in. So the question could be, so why is that demand side rising faster? I know Airbnb puts a lot into advertising, both online as well as outdoor advertising and indeed on TV as well. So they're really trying to grow that demand side of travellers travelling, and that's happening not just here in Australia but globally as well. So we're seeing an increasing number. For us, it's about half-half between domestic travellers and international travellers, but we're seeing the international travellers grow there as well. So reservations is increasing at the same time as reservations increase, the number of booked nights increase. So there's been over 1 million nights booked in Feb. In fact, in January, there was 1.5 million properties or nights booked in January. So I think that's a pretty impressive figure across Australia to have that many nights booked. Now, if we jump onto the metro and regional markets to see the difference there, this is something that is probably the most interesting little tidbit of information, and that's looking at where properties are being listed and how they're not all being listed in the metro regions of Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane. It's really, like here, if we're looking on New South Wales, it started out, 4 years ago, where most of the properties on Airbnb were listed here in Sydney. But if you look at it now, there's more properties listed outside of Sydney metro area than there are in Sydney, which together with what we've just discussed about how there's a correlation between where listings are and nights being booked, that shows that there's a huge opportunity outside of the Sydney region for putting your property on Airbnb and getting nights booked, which when we come to this at the end of today's chat, talking about where to buy, there's certainly some advantages in getting outside of those metro areas, particularly if this is one of your kind of a first investment property and trying to come in at a more affordable price point to buy. That's certainly an opportunity to jump in there as well. And this isn't the case just here in New South Wales. If we jump on to Queensland, it's very similar here, where the outside of those metro areas of Brisbane, Gold Coast and even Sunshine Coast, there's more listings. I mean, or probably equal listings as Gold Coast there, but there's more listings in those other areas outside of those three metros here on Airbnb. What you will see, just out of interest on this graph, is the peak there for the Gold Coast where the Commonwealth Games were on. So there was over 7,000 listings that popped up on Airbnb while the Commonwealth Games were on. So that's just, you can see where those local events, people were certainly taking advantage of the increase in travellers coming to Gold Coast, at least at that point. Moving on, like stories similar in elsewhere. The one area that's not as similar is in Melbourne. So in Victoria, there are still more properties in Melbourne listed on Airbnb than outside of Melbourne, this is the only state where that's the case. And for us, would see that as an opportunity for non-Melbourne or non-metro areas for people to get properties in those non-metro areas, such as your Bendigos, your Ballarats, or out Geelong. Well, not Geelong will be considered metro, but out further along the Great Ocean Road there, where there's be still opportunities for properties to grow in that non-metro region, like's happening in other states. Jumping on to South Australia, same story. Outside of Adelaide is where there's more listings. What you'll actually see there in South Australia is it was a little bit of a late bloomer, where activity on Airbnb really didn't happen until mid-2016, whereas other areas there was more activity happening earlier on. That said, the rate of growth is quite strong here in South Australia. Perth, similar story. Again, properties outside of Perth, there's more of them. I mean, WA is a very big state, but there's more properties outside of Perth in WA. And jumping into elsewhere, ACT, Northern Territory, Tas, look, the data's not quite as split for those, but what is most interesting here is the growth in Tasmanian listings, where ACT and Northern Territory are coming from a low base and staying pretty low, whereas Tasmania really has been growing, and we've certainly seen that in our own portfolio as well. Part of that would come to the accessibility in house prices, in getting into the market in Tasmania there. That certainly can attract particularly first home buyers or those who are looking at getting that rental yield to be a positively geared property. Tasmania is kind of commonly where people head. I mean, if we jump onto the overall slide, I mean, there's a lot of lines here to look at, but the key thing is that it's the non-metro areas that are growing the largest. Kind of just a bit of interest in this graph is also on that blue line, the light blue line, which is Sydney, where Sydney's where you certainly see the most New Year's Eve or summer activity popping up. So you get those peaks, not quite as much elsewhere. So Sydney must be the place to be come New Year's Eve each year. So that's the kind of a broad overview of where we see the Airbnb market here in Australia at the moment. The key takeaways there is definitely with listings come more reservations as people are choosing where they want to go based on what's available. And the non-metro areas is also certainly something to think about. Not that metropolitan areas or the cities is a bad place to be either. And when we work through some examples later on, you'll certainly see that as well. So we can see that Airbnb is growing. Now, what makes a perfect Airbnb? So what sort of property should you invest in, and what should you make your property look like for it to be good on Airbnb? So let's get started with that. What makes a property perfect for Airbnb? I'm just going to grab a drink here. So first up, let's get on the same page. What are we talking about when we say a perfect Airbnb property? As mentioned earlier, our focus here at Unchill is definitely on investment properties. So everything you do in managing your property on Airbnb should be about increasing revenue, while also focusing on efficiency in not overspending. So yeah, you could deliver an amazing 6-star accommodation experience for guests, decking your property out as an ultra boutique pad, picking your guests up from the airport, providing a bottle of champagne on arrival, daily housekeeping. People would pay for that, sure. But would they pay enough to justify the expense? Our experience suggests definitely not. So what's needed in making the perfect Airbnb property is weighing up the cost of doing something versus the additional revenue that it'll bring in. Some things are a no-brainer. They don't cost much, but bring in the dollars. Whereas some are costly, but if you don't do them, you may end up paying more through refunds or low vacancy rates. So despite that, there's still a lot that's open for your discretion. And it's those ones that are open for discretion that will make the difference between achieving a high yield by renting your property on Airbnb versus earning enough just to pay the bills to have your property on Airbnb. And also in considering the effort that you've had to put in to deal with it every day as well. So with what I'll be sharing with you today, you should be well positioned to be in the former category of getting the high yields with high efficiency. So let's get started with the first step, the physical stuff. Having a property that is actually suitable for short-term renting. And in explaining the physical stuff, the property itself, I want to share with you how to approach the cost value analysis across 3 requirements: the location, the property itself, and the furnishing. So for those joining me today that have already got a property listed on Airbnb, there's still stuff here that'll help you, but this info is really ideal for making your decision on where to buy next and what to do with that property when you buy it. So the location. I mentioned earlier, in Australia, more bookings are made on Airbnb for properties located outside of the metro areas. So as I showed you earlier, more bookings for stays are in regional, or rather non-Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane areas than in the capital. So earning money off Airbnb isn't just about having a property in a location that achieves the highest nightly rate, like a mansion overlooking Manly or Bondi here in Sydney. It's all about rental yield. How much are you going to be earning through rental income versus the capital invested in the property itself? So a mansion in Bondi may be going for, say, $1,500 a night. And I know some there that could. It certainly happens. But let's say, even on the optimistic side for a property at that price, it gets 75% occupancy, which I think for a property at that price is very optimistic. So that's going to bring in $410,000 a year in revenue. So that's impressive rental income in anyone's books. That's almost $500,000 in rental income. But a property like that is going to be a pretty penny. If someone's willing to pay $1,500 a night, they're going to want a nice property. So that's potentially upwards of a $5 million mansion in order to achieve that sort of result. So even if it is bringing that amount of money with that high occupancy, with that purchase price, the yield's going to be 6.5% maybe, which then once you take out all the costs associated with managing such a large and expensive property to a luxury standard that someone who's paying $1,500 a night would expect, look, you may find that this property would be better off on the long-term market. So the question then is, where is best to buy? And in the second part of this webinar, I'll be diving into the best locations to invest for short-term renting. But as a general guide, it doesn't have to be beaches, it doesn't have to be inner city, it doesn't have to be a tourist hotspot, but what it does need is to be accessible. And so some of the factors to think about includes access to public transport, services nearby, so such as like hospitals can be a great way of having consistent non-seasonal bookings, and other existing accommodation options in the area. So think motels and certainly not just the glamorous hotels, but other accommodation options. Your local pub that might have a couple of rooms upstairs. So I'll go through the factors that make, after I go through these factors, I'll give you a broader market overview. But for now, let me give you an example of a surprise that really hit me. And so Toongabbie, postcode 2146, it's in New South Wales, 30 kilometres west of the Sydney CBD. Not somewhere that is known for tourists. Indeed, I've lived in Sydney for about 8 years now, and until we started managing a property there, I'd never heard of it. So it's safe to say this property is in the middle of suburbia, hard to get to by public transport, and on paper would not be a location that you expect to perform well, at least well on Airbnb. So what this property did have going for it though was its proximity to growing suburbs in Western Sydney. So with large developments happening near Parramatta, demand for short-term accommodation was far exceeding supply. But what made this one of the best performers in our portfolio wasn't the gross revenue brought in. It certainly wasn't getting $1,500 a night, that's for sure. But it was the uptick in rental yield. So a place like this, 30 Ks out of Sydney, out of the Sydney CBD, so it's still in Sydney, suburban Sydney, would traditionally have only leased for, at max, $550 a week, at max. At full occupancy, so if you divide that by 7 days in a week, that's just $78 a night to house an entire family at a long-term rate. So this is, I think we're talking here, a 4-bedroom property. So any motels or hotels around the area would be charging at least $100 a night for a single room. And a single room is for 2 people, max really. Suddenly you have a family, and this is a property that's got 4 bedrooms. This can definitely fit a family. I mean, that's 8 people, just 2 in a room there. I think this one actually had some bunk beds for kids in one room. If you're having to pay, 4 rooms, let's call it, that's $400 a night to stay at a motel or whatever happens to be nearby for the family. That's expensive. So now, let's say it's $350, $400 to stay at a hotel for the family for the night, suddenly, if they were to pay that amount to stay in this property here, this 4-bedroom property, that's the equivalent of about one night at one night at $300, $400 is almost going to cover the rent for the week. So let's say it's rented for 2 nights a week, so Friday night, Saturday night even, and it's beating the long-term rent already. I mean, ka-ching, that's what we're here to do, and that's what we do day in, day out. And this is a great example of how it's not about buying in the sexiest location, but buying where the yield uplift is the highest. So the thing to do there is make sure you do the research, know the value of the rentals in the market, both on the long-term and short-term market, and together with the value of the home itself. During the week, actually, I had a great question submitted regarding an Airbnb Plus property in Perth. So someone who's joining us today is currently on Airbnb, property in Perth. It's in a nice suburb. It's had a great renovation, I'm told, includes a pool, it's near a marina. It sounds great. When I'm next over, it sounds like where I'd want to stay. But apparently it's not earning as much as it should, or as we'd like it to be. So the question came as, look, if I search for my area on Airbnb, all the nearby accommodation is listed, and anyone who knows the areas in Perth would know that there's a difference. But if you're not from Perth, you may not know the difference between perhaps a nicer suburb and something that's nearby, which is less nice, depending how much time they put into the search. So the question here is, how can we stand out from the crowd? How can this listing stand out from the crowd? And that's a great question. So quickly, I mean, hopefully everything that I talk about today will help answer that question, but just specifically on this Perth one, and given it's location focused, I think this comes in nicely here. And it's really about presenting there's kind of 3 things. One is including the suburb and location in the title of the listing, making it super clear to someone the suburb and kind of what's good about the suburb. So someone's already filtered down to a 2-bedroom place, so they know what they're looking for there. But they may not have considered that a particular suburb is nicer than another one. So if you're starting to push into the title there that this is in suburb whatever, then people will be like, oh, what is suburb whatever? No one else is mentioning that, so what's so good about this one? So think about that, including it in the title. When you can also nudge your guests to leave reviews which mention great locations. So Airbnb will give people filters of what people have said in reviews, and great location is one of the sort of terms that can get filtered down for. So you can't tell an Airbnb guest what to say in the review, but you can certainly, when you're prompting them, be like, hey, thanks for staying. It was really nice hosting you. I'd love it if you could leave a review. Mention that it was a great location. Little hints like that just nudge people in the right direction as to what to say. And of course, the third point is my usual point for how to do better on Airbnb is to not just use Airbnb. Use Booking.com, use HomeAway, try and get onto Expedia or Agoda, get us onto as many platforms as possible to try and get those reservations up as well. So that's kind of an intro to the location there. Next, if we jump on to the property itself, so you know where you want to invest, the market returns look good, the uplift by switching to short-term leasing is apparent. Now the next question to ask is, what sort of property should you be buying in that area? Again, there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer to this, but there are a few rules of thumb you can use to make sure you're on the right path. And when we look at this, let's look at bedrooms. So when it comes to bedrooms, more is always better. 3 or 4 bedroom properties are great, more are even better. Our average number of guests per reservation is 4.4. We most commonly see families travelling, so mum, dad, kids, or in fact we now also see the kind of the slightly older child taking their now semi-retired parents on a trip to Australia. So we see a bit of that as well. So the size of the property for a group like that travelling is kind of 2 or 3 bedrooms is ideal. Going smaller to a 1-bedroom or studio will limit your ability to gain huge increases in rental yield. And this is because studios and 1-bedroom homes are directly competing against hotels and motel rooms. So 2 people can stay in a hotel room just as 2 people can stay in a studio. Whereas a family needing 3 bedrooms would require 3 hotel rooms or just 1 3-bedroom home. And that's where the cost benefits of using Airbnb become apparent for guests when they're traveling. I will put a caveat on going big. So while a 5-bedroom home will likely attract really high nightly rates and have great occupancy, it can also come with a higher risk. In larger groups, people are more likely to misbehave. If not managed well, the issue of party houses can happen. And this directly relates to a question that was submitted during the week also. The question was quite simply, risk management. How can you avoid the party trashers? And can say, it's a great question. First up, I mean, the smaller properties, you'll have a substantially lower risk of party trashers, as you call them. I mean, there's still a risk, but if there's only 2 people staying, there's less chance of 2 people having a raging party than there is if there was a group of 8 or 10 people traveling. So if you are going big, you need to make sure that you've got appropriate policies and actions in place to prevent anything untoward happening. So this is where things like what we have in our homes, which are digital home monitors, they come in really handy. So we can remotely tell exactly what's happening in the property. So we can't see or hear what's being said. It's not surveillance, but it's monitoring the home's health. So we know the temperature, the humidity, the volume of noise in decibels, how much movement's going on, and any substantial unexpected changes that occur. So this is really useful because issues tend to only arise when guests are doing something wrong. So it could be having more guests in the property than they should, which get a bit rowdy, has loud musics, and that suddenly annoys neighbours and has a higher chance of damage to the property. So what do we notice to see that? I mean, it could be a rise in the level of movement in the property. It could be an increase in the volume of noise in the property. It could be an increase in the temperature of the property because there's all these bodies in there as well. So by monitoring what's going on in the home without invading privacy, that's a big thing, allows you to proactively try and stop these situations escalating. So we've got thresholds set when it comes to noise increases over a certain decibel for beyond like 120 seconds. We'll get notified straight away, and so then you can call the guest and be like, hey, just touching base, what's going on? But if there is a party going on, they're unlikely to answer their phone, and at which point you can then kind of swing around to check it yourself. If you live nearby, or otherwise engaging a company like ourselves will then send security people out to keep an eye on that property. So without doubt, this is the best way to protect yourself, or protect your property, I should say, from the party trashers. But really, really good question. So the next I want to talk about amenities. So we'll talk about the location and the actual property size. So now looking at amenities, so what makes a perfect property on Airbnb? And I'll start with a quote that the Airbnb co-founder and CTO Nathan B said in an interview last year, that if you offer a hairdryer, you can make on average $10 more a night. And this is globally. They've looked at it and they say if you have a hairdryer, you can make on average $10 more a night. And I say hairdryers are cheap. You can get a hairdryer at Kmart for about $15. So suddenly that's going to pay off very quick. So the amenities make a big difference. Like bedrooms, the more amenities the better, but not everything's worth the cost. This is where you really need to think about the cost versus what's going to come in. That hairdryer example is easy. You spend $10 and within 1.5 nights you've paid it off. Whereas another example could be, let's say, people might want to stay in a place that has a spa, a sauna, a pool, a tennis court, a hot tub, direct beach access, 24-hour concierge. But if your guests are only paying $100 a night, the cost just wouldn't be worth it. I mean, there's when it comes to amenities, there's a baseline that you'll need, but beyond that, there's judgment calls as to whether the extra expense will be worth it. And that's where you can work out if you're going to be earning more by switching to short-term renting or not. Earlier, I had a question submitted as well, so thanks for this. It was one of the most common questions I get asked all the time, and it's because it's a really good one. The question was really simple, 5 words: how to get more bookings, full stop. 6 words if you throw in a full stop there, but how to get more bookings. And looking at these amenities is definitely one way of getting your property listed higher on Airbnb search listings, which will help get more bookings. So when we're talking about, well, what's the baseline for those amenities? Obviously a hairdryer. We just talked about that. Our friend Nathan, this co-founder of Airbnb, said a moment ago. Wi-Fi is almost a definite must. Iron and ironing board, similarly. Washing machine and dryer. Important here is dryer. Ticking dryer is a whole lot better than just ticking washing machine. Dishwasher is up there as one of the most ticked boxes. Aircon and heating. Interesting, when it comes to aircon and heating, in a survey published by Airbnb last year, 46% of Australians, so almost half of Australians, would rather have air conditioning in the property they're staying at on Airbnb than have internet. So more people would actually rather air conditioning than internet when travelling, or not more, 46% while travelling here in Australia on Airbnb, which I think is a huge stat. So even if a property that you've got doesn't have air conditioning installed, consider even if it's a simple air conditioner which allows you to tick that box of saying you've got an air conditioner, how can you get an air conditioner in that property, even if it's simple and perhaps on the lighter side? Is that doable? Is that something you can do? Portable air conditioners could also work in some cases, but certainly it's less ideal, but it can work in some areas as well. And of course, kitchen utensils. People want to be able to use the kitchen, pots, pans, and things like that. So when you're thinking, so when it comes to the amenities, you have to acknowledge that your guests aren't going to be spending all their day there. They're traveling and are likely only in and out for 3 or 4 days. Something else to think about would be if you're buying an apartment, consider the cost of the body corporate fees. So again, that property that has a barbecue, rooftop barbecue, whatever, it doesn't look so good for free. Your body corporate fees are paying for it. So consider that when investing in apartments as to whether those additional, I'm going to call them luxuries, which are great if you're actually living in the property yourself and you want to enjoy that. But if you're having guests, are they going to be paying that extra amount for them? So an example here is we've got some amazing properties in Brisbane. One has 3 rooftop pools, a private cinema, 24-hour concierge, in-room dining options, and a world-class gym. Great amenities. Like, I'd love to stay there. But I don't know if I'd be happy paying the thousands of dollars per quarter in strata fees to help cover the cost of those. So that's where that cost benefit, you need to consider not just the capital investment invested in buying the property, but also there's ongoing costs of strata fees, particularly for apartments there. So actually, still on that Brisbane example, we have another apartment, more than one, but we've got other apartments very nearby, that's doesn't have a pool, doesn't have any of those additional services, but it isn't. There isn't a huge price difference between the two. And so you then need to work out, say, well, what's the difference in the body corporate fees? So let's say if the body corporate fees are suddenly a quarter of the price, so suddenly across a year, let's say you're saving 2 or 3, you could be saving $8,000 or let's call it $10,000 to keep it round. Let's say you're saving $10,000 a year in body corporate fees. What's that? That's $200 a week. Are you going to be earning $200 a week more by having all those facilities? $200 a week, let's say 75% occupancy. My maths probably isn't good enough to do that right on the spot, but that's going to be, what, $30 a night? Let's call it $30 a night. Is that property going to get $30 more a night than the one without the pool? Maybe that would be a kind of ballpark. I'm not sure. It could go either way, and that's where we'd really need to drill that down on those numbers to work out what it would be. So that's kind of on the amenities. If we jump onto what you'd think is a small thing, but a question that we get a lot is about parking. And just like bedrooms, just like amenities, more is always better, but at least having a car park. There's some interesting Airbnb data that was released last year. which showed that the majority of Airbnb guests traveling in the US, Australia, and Canada would prefer free parking over a swimming pool. Which is interesting, but the majority of guests traveling in the US, Australia, and Canada would prefer free parking over a swimming pool. So as I mentioned earlier, the most common type of guest is a family traveling. They're looking to stay in homes or apartments to allow them to have breakfast together, go out and enjoy the day, and then come back, read their book, have a glass of wine, go to bed, whatever. But it's also quite common for these families to have a car. They've arrived at the airport, grabbed a car, and plan on exploring the city, or particularly if you're in those regional areas, non-metro areas, exploring with a car. And so knowing that a car park is available for use adds huge value to the guests, while not usually adding much additional expense to you. I mean, if your property already has a car park, easy. But if you can, if your property doesn't have a car park, what you could consider doing is find a car park nearby that you can rent at an affordable price per month, and give access to your guests to that car park. That way, they still have a free car park, a reserved car park they can use, even if it's not directly in the same building or right at the spot. So there's an app, Parkhound. We've used that before to find car parks within a few minutes walk of the property and allowed guests to park there. It gives them confidence before booking that yes, there will be a car park somewhere. They know that it's not going to be an exorbitant price like hotels. And it also means when people are filtering your property online on Airbnb, one of the filters they might tick is has parking, and now your property has the opportunity of appearing in those searches, which is really important. The final bit about the actual property itself, and along with where to buy, what amenities to have, whether to have parking, is the furnishing. And this is really the final rule in creating the perfect Airbnb rental. Creating it yourself is the furniture and the fit out of the property. And it's a big one. It's where a lot of people spend a lot of money on a lot of unnecessary things. And once you've spent that money on the furniture or whatever it happens to be, you've then got to make sure that over the next 12, 36 months that you're going to be earning more than you would have on that property without that item. So question here is, will that extra $2,000 on a leather lounge add an extra $10 per night to every booking? Does going from a Kmart brand microwave at $39 is that going to increase, give you an extra dollar for every booking than a $200 David Jones model? And is that worth it? So they're the sort of questions you have to think about. Like, is everyone even looking at the brand of a microwave when they're trying to book a place? The answer is they're not. So that's like a simple example of where you don't need to be overspending. When furnishing for most properties, you should be aiming to furnish to a comfortable standard as opposed to designer. And actually, speaking of designer, look, if you can, get a professional to come up with the furniture design. A mood board from a professional can make a huge difference. It's really not as simple as heading out to Freedom and IKEA and getting a bunch of stuff. Leaving a stylist to plan it can make a huge difference for you, regardless of your budget. It'll make a huge difference. For example, we've got stylists that work directly for us, and they spend all day furnishing new Airbnbs. And the budgets that we set with these guys isn't too high. Like, we've got budgets that really start around $9K for a 2-bedroom home, and we'd rarely encourage spending much more than that on a normal property. Of course, if your property is in the luxury segment, and I'll add that while you may consider your property luxury, compare it to luxury hotels and then reassess. I think the term luxury gets thrown around by developers and real estate agents a tad too freely. But anyway, if your property is in that luxury segment, then spending more on furniture is necessary. Again, that mansion back in Bondi, $1,500 a night, people are going to expect nice furniture in that. Somewhere in Brisbane, paying $200 a night, expectations aren't there. Look, there's a bunch of tips I can go through, things on whether to go for a double bed or a queen size bed, sofa beds, how much kitchen appliances and things do you need, and should you put an espresso machine in? We've got some great packs on that. In fact, we've got a ebook on how to set up your property as a successful Airbnb. So if you're interested in that, rather than me going through it right now, flick an email to us and we'll happily send you a copy of that ebook. It's got a lot of information that's really, really useful in actually setting up your property. So once you've bought the property and you've got the right property, once to fit it out, definitely have a look at that ebook. It's got so much information and will definitely save you money and stop you buying unnecessary things. In short, don't get an espresso machine. I'll give you that hint now. So the biggest rule when it comes to furnishing is not to overspend. Make it look good with a few key pieces of good furniture and wall art, but keep the basics basic. So, in summary, that's what makes a perfect Airbnb rental property. To recap, it's all about keeping a cool head in completing the cost value analysis in making those 3 key decisions around the location, around the property itself, and around the furnishing. And it's certainly not about having the fanciest house. Always remember that this is an investment, not a home. And speaking of investments, so let's now dive into the best locations to invest. So let's look at the market as to where, I'll give you some examples of some places that are really hot and give you that uplift in rental yield straight away. So we use a combination of third-party data scrapers, like AirDNA, CoreLogic RP data, together with our own historic performance data to crunch the numbers on how much a property could earn on Airbnb. And there's a few factors at play that are worth considering when looking at the market and where to jump into yourself. So thinking about the level of activity on Airbnb at the moment. Again, back to what I talked about at the start, where the correlation between where listings are and where reservations happen. That's something to think about. The estimated rental income possible on Airbnb for the property itself. So this is where what I'm about to run through is looking at how much can a property get, what is the expected occupancy for January, February, March, April, May, June, what's the expected average nightly rate for January, February, March, April, May, June. So what's that annualized return? Everything you do when looking at the estimate for a rental income on a short-term property really needs to be on a 12-month basis. Just looking at particular months, some will be good, some will be bad, but you need to look at it on that annualized figure. The other thing you have to look about, of course, is the uplift from the long-term rental. So knowing how much the place would get on the long-term market normally is really important. So earlier I took you through some data on the growth of listings on Airbnb, and the key takeaway from that is growth is happening Australia-wide. But let's now zoom into a few markets. I'll talk about 4 particular markets, and I'll show you how we'll complete the assessments on that property in each of those markets, and what the outcome would be from that as to whether you would switch to short term. The hint now is that yes, we'd switch to short term in each of these examples, of course. So first one comes up from Perth. We had a question earlier, so thanks again for submitting that question, that was based on a property in Perth. So let's head west and take a look at what's happening there. And this was a property that we've recently got. It's in Perth. It's got 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom. I think it's about 10-15 minutes from the city. And it's probably a 10-year-old, maybe just over 10-year building itself, an apartment. Its estimated worth here is about 300K, or between 275 and 325. So let's call it 300K. How much would that get on the long-term rental market? You'd be looking, if we look at properties that have been rented out recently nearby, here around Victoria Park, you're seeing 300, 320 per week. This is all in July 2019. Again, all for 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, 1 car park. So let's call that on average 307 a week. So you're bringing in just under 16,000 per annum, which on that $300,000 purchase price, you're looking at a rental yield of about 5.32, which, can I say, compared to other areas around Australia, that's actually not a bad rental yield, taking into account, of course, that that's the gross rental yield. So you have to take out your property management commissions, your letting fees, and costs there as well. But 5.3 is actually not too bad, really, for a long-term property. But now if we jump into how much it would get on the short-term market here in Perth, this same 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom property at the exact same address, our estimate comes in at $33,431 as the annual revenue, coming in from $129 a day average daily rate across the year. and 71% occupancy across the year. And you can see here what we've calculated is the month-by-month basis. So we don't just do it on 1 month and then say, okay, it'll be the same every month of the year. We look at it on a month-by-month basis as to what's the occupancy in properties nearby, what was the nightly rate for similar properties in the same sort of area with the same number of bedrooms, and how's that going to look throughout the year. Here we're seeing in January, this may be a little bit perplexing, but you'd see in January the actual revenue would be not the highest of the year, and that this is coming usually from a increase in supply around January as people, those kind of mums and dads who are off to Europe for 6 weeks, chuck their properties on Airbnb. So it's not always as simple as assuming January is going to be a huge month for holidays. It really can change. What you'll also see from our analysis, the nightly rate will vary a fair bit from $120 to $160 a night. And this is something we need to be aware of. So when we're pricing the property, we're not just leaving it at the same $160 a night all year round. If we left it at $160 a night all year round, it's not going to get booked in those lower months. So it's all about making sure that we can still achieve that occupancy by changing the price. I mean, it's a simple market operation. Drop the price, you're going to increase occupancy, but if you drop the price too much, you may end up with too high occupancy and suddenly you're not capturing all of what you should be. So that's something to think about and what we plug into our models when looking at a property. So overall, this property here in Perth, it's jumping from a 5.3% rental yield to an 11.1. That's almost double. Almost double. My maths isn't good on the spot there, but almost double in the rental yield. And this is all based on real results. So this isn't us just making up these figures and having a guess. Like here, I've got 6 other properties that this really compares with in number of bedrooms, number of locations over the last 12 months and how much they've earned on Airbnb. So you can see the one there called a New York City style apartment near Perth CBD had 71% occupancy across the year, brought in $35K of revenue and had an average daily rate of $151. The one next to it there on the top line, central location, Wi-Fi and parking, 2 beds, 1 bath. It brought in $32.5K in the year with 80% occupancy and $120 for an average daily rate. Chic apartment near Stadium. This property has only been available for 4 or 5 months of the year. During that period, it's had 88% occupancy, but if extrapolated across the full year, taking into account seasonality, that's going to earn just over 30K. So these are based on real results, and this is what you need to look at when trying to do the analysis on how much is that property going to bring in. So that was over in Perth. Hopefully that helps the person that we were working with earlier. Now let's jump into regional New South Wales. So jumping into the Central Coast, it's a couple of hour drive north of Sydney. We're looking here at a property that's a house, freestanding house. It's 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and would usually be a family home, but given its location, could also be, for what we would do in short term, kind of a weekender, maybe beach house style place where you could go take the family for a bit of a break outside of Sydney. The estimated value is somewhere between 625 and 750. Let's just call that an even 700 for our calculations today. Maybe on the little lower side of that, but it would depend actually on the quality of it here. But let's call it 700 for today's analysis. So how much would that get per week? Look, comparable rentals around here, all really close to them. 3 bedrooms, some of these has 2 bathrooms, so some of these would actually be a little bit worse. Some of them 2 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, parking. They range between $320, $395, $430 per week on the long-term market, and these are all from the last couple of months. So yeah, estimated returns, let's say the average of that is $383 per week, or just shy of $20K per annum. Now, if you put that $20K per annum on a $700,000 property, you're not going to get much. That's a 2.8% yield for gross rental, which is, I'm not really too surprised, but I certainly wouldn't be too happy with that as a rental yield. You'd want to have purchased that property a few years back at a cheaper price, that's for sure. That said, so switching from long-term to short-term, the difference here is huge. So here you're going from 2.8% yield to 7.15%. You're switching from just shy of 20K a year in rental income to over $50,000, which can I say is huge. It is huge. What you will see here on this graph is in some months, like May, June, July, even August, May, June, July, August, you're probably only going to be bringing in 2K a week, 2K a month, which really isn't a huge. By the time you take out some cleaning fees and assuming there's property management, which is at a slightly higher rate than long term, you're probably going to own those months, May, June, July, August, bringing in very similar around that $400 a week figure. But with a property like this, what you are doing is you're capturing, September, October, November, December, January, Feb. You're capturing 2 to 3 times that weekly rate. So even though in those May, June, July, August, you're probably sitting around the same as long-term renting, jump into those other months and you're 2 to 3 times as high, which across the year is where we get that $50,000 annual revenue. If we jump to the next slide there, we're looking at the nightly rates. This one's huge variance in the actual rate, going from $129 to $225 a night. Again, this is the importance where the kind of importance of occupancy comes in, importance of price minimization, price optimization in order to maximize occupancy and maximize occupancy to get people in there. So here, we're even looking at this in June, the estimate's at less than 40% occupancy, which really, to me, reads like just weekends and maybe a long weekend in there. Again, this is coming from real results. We've got some 5 properties here that are on Airbnb. If we jump to the next slide, where they've earned similar amounts over this 12-month period, comparable. In fact, one there is probably looking a little bit better. It's got a swimming pool, but the others range from something that's probably not the sort of furniture I'd put into the property, the top left there, to something that's looking quite fine, looks really nice, the one top right. So really, you can see what's going on there. Something to note also here is the bottom right one coming, the Corso, that's got a 76K revenue potential forecast here compared to, let's say, the one above it at 35K. And the difference between those two is the number of bedrooms. So we're going from 2 bedrooms in Lakeview Cottage to 4 bedrooms in the one below it. And the increase in revenue potential is almost double. In fact, it is double. And the difference there was those extra 2 bedrooms. So when making a purchase decision, thinking about, well, is going from a 2-bedroom place here in the Central Coast to a 4-bedroom place going to be double the price? I'm going to say probably not double. It may be, maybe 1.5 times the price, but the rental returns going to be double. That's something to think about, and comes back to the idea of having more bedrooms. I'll jump into 2 more suburbs to have a quick look. Bondi, it's always talked about as the short-term rental hotspot of Australia. Here I'll look at a little studio. It's currently available for rent actually at $360 per week. It's been recently sold actually, so I know that's pretty confident, around the $595K. So this would give a long-term gross yield of 3.4, which I'd say in Sydney is kind of to be expected. That's pretty acceptable for Sydney, really. Jumping onto the short-term market, though, for a property here, it's going to double that short-term yield, or just under doubling it, going from 3.4 to 6.29% in the short-term gross rental yield. Something that's interesting here is the annualized occupancy is only around 66%, so we're not aiming too high for that. Reason being, there is a lot of competition, but that said, even with 66% occupancy rate and a $156 average nightly rate, the return is still almost double what you would get on the long-term market. Also taking notice here, like June, July, August, winter months is not the time to be going to Bondi. Water is probably a little bit too cold to jump in for a surf in those months, so revenue will be lower. But jump into Feb, March, or even Jan, Feb, March, when water is a lot warmer, that's where those revenues of 4K, almost 4K, just over 4K a month would be possible. Again, looking at that next slide with the nightly rates and occupancy, you've got to consider all of that when putting in, plugging in the information into the calculator and making sure that you're ready to accept, here in June, to accept pretty low occupancy and a fairly low average nightly rate. So if making a purchase decision, do consider, come a month like June, rental income is going to be lower. Is that enough to service your mortgage if that's the way you're going? That's certainly something to think about, so you're not caught by surprise throughout the year. Again, this is looking at real results from properties in Bondi. I mean, there's a bunch of properties in Bondi there. There's 6 examples on that next slide. So this data is pretty accurate in getting there. In fact, yeah, it's all very accurate. But let's jump into the final place I was going to look at in Adelaide. So Adelaide, this is a property in the CBD in Adelaide. This is somewhere, what did I say earlier? That there's 5% of listings and 5% of reservations and 5% of nights booked in Australia on Airbnb all come from Adelaide, and that is growing. Place here in the CBD, 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom, $570K to buy. And on the long-term market, that's going to get about 3.9% yield. If we look at the ones that have been rented recently around the same sort of area, 500 per week, 385, 520, 390, 375. So work on an average of that of about 434 per week, or 22,500 per annum. So that's giving us just shy of 4% rental yield. Jumping from that 3.95 or just shy of 44% rental yield to short-term renting, we'd be getting up to 3.7%. So, it's not 7.7%. So going from 3.9 to 7.7%. Again, solid increase, 43K in annual revenue, average occupancy there as well. We're seeing, surprise, surprise, June being one of the lowest, as is the case just about everywhere. But similar figures to what we've seen elsewhere. Jumping onto the nightly rates. Here, what's interesting, this is CBD, so there's less of a variance in that nightly rate. What you will find in our example, let's say Central Coast or Bondi, where there's a lot more seasonality for tourist travellers. Here in a property in the CBD, that's less likely to vary too much, and sitting there between 180 and 217 per night. Again, there's some examples of the sorts of properties on Airbnb that this data has been collected from, and I won't go into those too much further. So finally, I did mention at the start that there was a way that you'd almost be sure to earn more than others on Airbnb through short-term renting. And this comes from us having been managing professionally properties on the Airbnb for over 3 years now, having managed over 800 properties and welcomed almost 100,000 guests. So that's an MCG full worth of guests. The answer is simple. Don't just list your property on Airbnb. Less than half our bookings come through Airbnb, and this is how we're able to maximize occupancy even beyond what was shown earlier. So we're getting all that occupancy data from Airbnb, but we mix that with what we have internally through our other channels like Booking.com, Expedia, Ctrip, Agoda, and the like. In fact, our properties are all listed on over 10,000 different websites where people can see their property and instantly book them. And that's really what makes the biggest difference in getting maximum yield. There were a couple of other questions actually submitted before we got started, and I will just touch on at least one of those. And that was a general rule. A question was for Melbourne apartments within 6K of the CBD, what percentage of a 12-month lease should you be reasonably aiming for when switching to short-term renting? And here the figure really is around that 170% plus, or 1.7 times plus is what you should be aiming for in order to get solid returns to increase your rental return. And with that, the question will be, well, surely even if you're earning 20% more, that's good. Why do you have to earn 70% more than just long-term renting? And the thing is, you do have to consider some extra costs involved. So the cost of internet, the cost of electricity, the cost of probably additional property management fees, and the cost of cleaning coming in and going as well. So you're aiming for at least 107 or at least a 1.7% increase. Without cost, you'll be earning more and to make it worthwhile. But that's just about it for today. We're just on an hour, so thanks for joining me today. Reach out if you'd like more info, if you'd like us to crunch the numbers and see how much your property or property you're looking at could earn. But also reach out if you're after that ebook to give you some more information on how you should best furnish and set up your property. Thanks very much. Cheers.